All right, YouTube, I wanted to cover the sort of aspect of impending financial collapse or social collapse paired with that, really, that's being talked about so much by so many people, sort of on the fringes of the economic community. I think we've got to realize at this point that there is a definitive difference between the picture that's being painted by the banking sector, by DC, by the governments of the world, and the reality on the ground, really, that's experienced by the majority of the population. I think when we look, for instance, at sort of the illusion of growth that's been happening for the last few years, we look at the illusion of growth in many countries. It does not quite sync up with the claims of the claims of growth that are being made. Don't appear to sync up with the reality on the ground on Main Street here in the United States, or really among the lower middle classes, or even elements of the upper class in some cases throughout most of the world. There was an interesting article on China that suggested that their growth may be a hell of a lot slower than they're letting on, based on their electrical consumption, sort of by industry and by residents there. That there appears to be a disconnect between the numbers that are being given by the Chinese government, which is legendarily opaque about things, and the actual sort of consumption that you would assume would go along with people, with the economy increasing, the middle class there growing more wealthy in general, things advancing and developing. There appears to be a definitive disconnect between the two levels. You can see that at work here. The markets, people seem to be under the delusion that the stock market reflects reality for the average person. Oh, well, stocks are double. The economy's twice the size that it was. Everything's twice as good as it was before. That's not the way in which it works. The stock market has always been all over the place, and traditionally what you see after one of these large spikes is that it's mostly the result of a bubble forming. This one would be referred to as a mega bubble. Now, I don't focus solely on the United States. I think the United States may be in for some rough times, as clearly the overvaluation of our entire economy is so grossly miscalculated and being fed primarily by funny money from the government that's being pumped into banks and businesses. I think when that corrects, it's going to be a hard time for people here in the United States, especially when you consider the actual unemployment rate is double what the given unemployment rate is. The way they calculate it has changed in order to paint a rosier scenario, when in reality, other than people who have, admittedly, some of the boomers are retiring, that's dragged that number up. That doesn't explain it all, not even by a long shot, and a lot of people who are at retirement age aren't bothering to retire if they can possibly hold off doing so, because the economy is so grim that they'll end up penniless. They'll end up out on the streets or in a slum or something like that. I personally choose to believe that if a person has worked hard all their life, there is no legitimate reason that they should be homeless. There is no legitimate reason that they should be living in a slum tenement. I don't choose to believe that. That doesn't make me a liberal or a progressive. That makes me somebody who's composed of common sense and capable of using, rational, logical thought. I think that that's abominable, personally, what's happening to some of the elderly in the United States. Through no fault of their own, they've done nothing wrong. They worked for decades and decades during the period of prosperity. Now they get their layoff notice and their minute pension, if they're getting one at all, because half of them are bankrupt, and then they're getting Social Security or whatever. Then they have to buy into this healthcare fiasco that's draining more of their money away. Meanwhile, prices are rising steadily, and they find themselves with choosing basically between, well, do I want to pay my mortgage or my rent or my taxes or whatever I owe, or do I want to eat, because I can only do one or the other. And naturally, a lot of people have gone on food stamps. We're at record highs on that. We're at record highs in people drawing sort of unemployment for the most part. People who are working part-time or they're underemployed in general is at an all-time high as well. That's not a strong economy. That's not an economy at all. You've got to understand, when they're talking about adding jobs to the U.S. economy right now, most of those jobs are entry-level and part-time positions. They are not productive. in the sense that they add to the overall economy. They're service sector jobs. These aren't people that are producing goods. These are people that are involved with distributing it, selling it to other individuals after they've already been manufactured, often in China or something like that. It has nothing to do with really growing the economy at all. You're not even getting any tax revenue off these people. They're not making enough to be taxed. So how on earth is that growing the economy? The only way to logically grow the economy, you can either take more from the investing class, the 1/10 of 1%ers. You can do that, or you can grow the middle class so that you're getting tax revenue from people who would otherwise be taking money from the government because they've been forced into double shift at Wendy's or something. Or you can do both. Preferably you're doing both, because the vulture capitalists, the cronyists, already got hundreds of billions in bailout money and squirreled it off and ran off with it. Nobody even really got charged for the most part. They took America for a ride to the tune of, I think it was 1.2 trillion or something all told, between the banks and some of these corporations that were bailed out, and then they threw tens of billions of more at other corporations, half of which went belly up. But here's the real problem. The real problem with the world economy right now isn't even the United States. Dire as though that may seem, with real unemployment hovering around 10%, with a record low labor participation rate, with all the problems that are in the United States, with most people living paycheck to paycheck, even now the upper middle class not necessarily doing as good as they would like to do. When the upper middle class is negatively being affected by things, you know that there's a fucking problem. But dire as though that may sound, the United States is not the biggest of my worries. China is. And I'll tell you why. China has supposedly eclipsed the United States in terms of its total value. You can argue either way. Again, the opacity within their economy makes it difficult to gauge whether that's actually true or not. Doesn't really matter, though. It doesn't matter if it's half the size of our economy or twice the size, because they're one of our largest trading partners, and we, the United States, are primarily responsible for propping up the largest segment of their economy, including a very large number of middle-class Chinese positions in managerial work, some investment work, clerical work, and so forth, as well as a lot of lower-wage jobs and high-wage jobs as well. They're the result of investment from Westerners, and they're also the result of a Western market to consume their goods. If the United States goes belly up tomorrow and enters another Great Depression or a massive recession or something else happens, and that means there will be less demand for those goods. People simply won't have the money to buy them. They'll be too focused on feeding themselves and keeping warm and not freezing or starving to death. They're not going to be buying baubles and cheap shit from China that's propping up a large proportion of their economy. What then happens to China? Well, they're already slowing down. They're already looking at the possibility of several of their own bubbles bursting. What happens to the Chinese? The Chinese economy goes down the shitter, and tens of millions of jobs are lost there. This then causes a further ripple effect. If the United States, which is the keystone of the Western economies of the world, suddenly falters, it drags everybody else down in the entire world. Nobody will escape it. The best possible places to be during such a scenario are oddly the shittiest places on Earth to be right now. Places with an agricultural surplus, an agrarian economy where people aren't used to having advanced technology anyway and really won't miss it because there's not as much of an economy. You know, Peru. People in Peru are not going to suffer disproportionately. They may be squeezed for a little more electricity, but as far as their food goes, they can grow their own food. They don't care. The Brazilians would potentially do fine. Some of these African nations that have become at least minor breadbaskets, some of the Asian nations as well. You might expect a nation that's somewhat advanced, although not quite all the way there, not post-industrial, like a nation like Turkey or Mexico, or even like Vietnam, to do fairly well. Other than that, all the major players, all the nuclear powers, India could go belly up, China could go belly up, Russia would get screwed. What happens when the U.S. economy dwindles and our own importation of fuel essentially goes away? Because there's less productivity, People have less money to spend anyway, so less fuel is being purchased, and we're already producing a great deal and protecting it on our own. We're going to burn up that fuel first. What happens when all of a sudden half of Russia's fuel sales drop off? What happens when the Chinese economy goes belly up and the Russians can no longer sell them gas because they're not willing to buy? What happens when Europe is freezing to death and they're not able to buy the gas either? Then the Russian economy goes. And so pretty soon everybody on Earth is clusterfucked as the result of the fact that people over here have largely manipulated money into making the illusion of prosperity. We have the illusion that things are going fine, but that's what it is. It's an illusion. It's a viewing the world through rose-tinted glasses sort of event, and it's not limited just to the United States. A lot of these other countries appear to be just as oblivious. The Chinese government appears utterly oblivious to what's happening. What are the Chinese investors currently doing? And it's got people in the West worried, but it's got me feeling actually more anxious about China suffering than the West becoming weaker on the world stage. What are they doing? They're beginning to privately invest overseas, just like the Japanese did before their own economy went belly up, and they stagnated and have been stagnant basically ever since. And now they're looking at a severe demographic crisis, which is going to drag their economy down the shitter in the next 10 to 20 years, because they're nowhere near replacement rate, and they're not willing to take many immigrants. Japan's fucked. And even if they were to start accepting immigrants, they'd still be fucked. Let me tell you, at this point, it's been too long. The Chinese have the same demographic problem looming, and it makes the baby boom over here look tame by comparison, because we're talking about several hundreds of millions of people. We're not talking about a few tens of millions of people in an economy where the same amount of productivity is the result of a far fewer number of workers, despite how gloomy things may be over here on this side of the Pacific Ocean. When I look into the immediate future of the world, I don't see all doom and gloom, and I don't see necessarily like an end times cataclysm, but I am looking at a massive, massive reduction in the world's overall productivity. This could lead to all sorts of destabilization, social and political upheaval. We've seen it before. We have seen this happen before. All of the events that led up to World War II were intrinsically rooted in World War I and the Great Depression and things of that nature. The misery that people were feeling at the time, all around the world, directly fed into the aggression of World War II. If it hadn't been for that misery, if people had been well-fed and employed and generally felt positive about the world around them, would they have supported the Nazis? No, they wouldn't have given a shit about Hitler. Would they have supported communism? No, because they wouldn't feel like they needed to collectivize in order to have enough cabbage soup to survive and enough half-moldy bread. They wouldn't have supported such movements. There would be no need for it. The sort of status quo of laissez-faire could have gone on forever if people weren't feeling that pinch. In the case of the United States, some of the sort of eugenics era stuff really picks up when people feel collectively miserable. A lot of the great evils and ills that were perpetuated in the United States were the direct result of the Great Depression. In Germany, Weimar Germany, with their insane inflation rate and spiraling unemployment and all of the other social problems there that relapsed over and over and over again, people again had the same problems. They turned to simply a different style of solution. This world has problems right now, not the least of which is the fact that politicians and elite bankers from around the world, along with military heads and corporate heads, have formed a sort of web of cronyism that's absorbed most of the productivity of all workers into a gigantic sort of satchel waiting to be detonated under the world economy. That's essentially what's happened. They've siphoned off most of the actual productivity and made a bunch of funny money. And they own most of that funny money, and they pay peanuts to everybody else to keep working, while simultaneously funding the media and making sure that people think things are generally okay. Well, they're not generally okay. You look at the downtown in your home city. It's probably emptier than it was 10 years ago. Look at the mall in your home city. It's probably emptier than it was 10 years ago. Look at the cars on the street. They're probably just a little bit rustier, maybe a few more dents in them than there were 10 years ago. Look at your paycheck. It might be quite a bit smaller if you've got a paycheck at all. And you're lucky, by the way, if you're even working full time in this economy. There are people with master's degrees competing for part-time entry-level positions that still have student loans to pay off. Let's face it, at this rate, will never pay them off unless they're fortunate enough to win the lottery. Then what happens if they do and we suddenly go into hyperinflation? Well, my lottery winnings equate to I just bought a bunch of bananas and I feel damn lucky that I was able to afford them. We've got some looming issues with the world economy right now that people don't seem to want to actually discuss. And the funny thing is, when people point out that there's a definitive disconnect between the actual situation that the average person in any of these countries experiences, whether it's the United States, Russia, China, wherever it may be, any part of the European Union, when you point out that there's a difference between what they experience and what their state media sort of says about, well, things are fine, we're recovering, the economy's growing, unemployment's falling, just trust us, you fucking morons. When you point that out, people will call you a conspiracy theorist. Well, I used to think the same. Years ago, when I looked at sort of, fiscal analysts saying, well, the actual unemployment rate's actually twice what they're telling you, by the way, I didn't believe them. I just assumed it was, they hated Obama because they thought he was a Kenyan socialist or something. Then I looked deeper into it, realized they were right, and I said, oh shit, well, this could be a problem. When I looked into the fact that you see sort of the same trend now that predicates things like the Great Depression, or like the last recession we already suffered through in living memory, then it begins to make me worry. And when I look and I see that the same situation, or even potentially worse situations, are at play in China and Russia and everywhere else, I say, oh shit, the entire world economy could implode. Because all you need is one of these large economies to go belly up to affect all of the others negatively. Then their bubbles burst, things get thrown into disarray there, and pretty soon before you know it, oh yeah, 50% of the world's wealth's just dried up. Don't worry about the hyper-rich, though. The investment class is fine. The politicians are fine. The big bankers are fine. Hell, they got huge amounts of money at taxpayer expense during the bailouts. What's Putin doing right now? And for all of you who think, oh, glorious Russia recovering, ruble bounces up 5% after losing half of its fucking value. For those of you who think that Russia's recovering, what's Putin doing right now to Gazprom and all of these other companies? He's doing exactly what the United States government did during the bailouts and after, pumping them with funny money to keep them afloat, to keep up this sort of illusion of normalcy that no, things aren't screwed up. Nah, business, you'll keep your job, don't worry. You may be paying twice as much for food, but it could be worse, comrade. Well, it could be worse, fellow citizen of the United States. It could be worse, fellow member of the Chinese Communist Party. It doesn't matter where they are in the world. They're all being lied to, essentially. They're all being told, yeah, by the way, things are fine. Don't worry to these doom and gloom forecasters. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, more and more of them appear to basically be syncing up and saying the same thing, and that's not a good sign. Yes, I see some problems in the coming months or few years. There's also the ever-present threat, I've pointed this out, there's still the ever-present threat of another world war breaking out. People are blind to this too. They've stopped even talking, for the most part, on the mainstream media about Ukraine. They're too busy talking about fucking deflated footballs. What does this tell you? Do you trust the media to actually tell you what matters? Well, if we assume that the media is not trustworthy, if we assume that they're generally liars, or at the very least they're telling you half-truths and pandering the whole time, and they're filled with bias and stupidity, and they don't really know what they're talking about, if we assume that they're that inept and lying that much, then if they're trying to focus us on footballs, or, Miley Cyrus' new sex video, or Shakira's new hairstyle, or look at this new Macklemore album, or any of these other things, when they're focusing single-mindedly on a bunch of pop culture and a bunch of social issues that largely have already passed in the social consciousness of the United States, like gay marriage, most people support it, get the fuck over it at this point. When they're focusing you on that and completely ignoring or covering for the economy, or the fact that, yeah, by the way, Putin's already threatened nuclear war against several different nations in the last few months, then there's a fucking problem. You should be looking at what they're not covering rather than what they are. And that's where the alternative media comes in. They're the only ones talking about it. People are more informed than they were 10 years ago because, thankfully, the internet is here to come to our rescue in the face of a mainstream media that really doesn't even cover major issues anymore. They're covering a bunch of bullshit, and the real issues they do cover, they spin it into so much oblivion that they simply snap people apart along blatantly partisan or racial lines, or gay or straight or male, female, anything else like that, and they get them fighting one another, and then they sit back and enjoy the shitfest, and they reap the ratings as the result of putting out something that was considered edgy 2 years ago. So yes, people need to probably take stock of that. Now, as far as my preparations go, I've got land, I've got seeds, I'm assuming that, it's going to continue to rain, so I'm not worried about feeding myself for the most part. Hell, I can plow up 2 acres of land here and grow anything that I happen to want, and I can potentially make a profit and have enough to eat. So I feel just fine. People in urban areas are worse off anyway. When the Great Depression hit, this state was virtually unaffected, believe it or not, because it was already rural and already lacked electricity. Nobody cared because their life was basically the same. They just said, oh, those rich big city folks done lost all their money. Well, I guess it's time to sell the farm. Not. That's basically the going line. By the way, sometime I'll have to tell you a very, very interesting story about root cellars and about dead relatives as it relates to northern Appalachia during the Depression period. Probably the weirdest, most morbid thing I've ever heard, and I keep trying to get the gumption here to continue work on a book about New England folklore. However, I've sort of been stymied on that because I'm working on other things. I'm working on several projects that are as yet to be named, as well as several things that I have discussed briefly. But I'll get to it. I promise in the next couple of years that'll be forthcoming at some point. That'll be a more mainstream work. But I know I'm completely off topic. As far as the world economy goes, no, there are very few bright spots on the world economy and a hell of a lot of dark spots. That's not a good sign. Unless you have some sort of major paradigm shift, like they invent something that just overall completely hyperdrives the world economy, like we've discovered free energy. By the way, all of the means of production now can be utterly overhauled. You won't have to pay anything for electricity. You won't have to pay anything for fuel anymore. World peace forever because we never have to fight over resources again. We can power everything with this new, whatever technology we've developed. Something like that. Or world's largest diamond and gold mine discovered. Estimated reserves at $10 trillion right in the heart of Kansas or something. Short of something like that happening, you're not going to see alleviation because mostly this entire problem has been the result of the government actually not allowing the economy to collapse the last time around. Instead, they've simply been pumping it, and so they've kept it well above its actual total value, and the GDP has not caught up to the level that they have pumped it to. Therefore, you can either slowly decline it over time and hope it doesn't collapse again before you get done, or else you're screwed, and kick the can down the road, I guess, would be the going term for it. Or you can let go with the money pumping and the funny money and the manipulation of people's own opinions, let it drop out and let it correct itself. But at this point, they've kept it afloat so long. If it were half the nation's value suddenly goes out the window, all of a sudden you got 10 million more unemployed people on top of the ones you already have, and then you have businesses going out, you have banks failing, and then the government doesn't even have the money to bail them out, even though it shouldn't have bothered bailing them fucking out in the first place. It would be a clusterfuck, and it would drag, like I said, some of these other countries down. China would be the most affected country on earth if the United States were to falter. If the United States collapsed tomorrow and into a depression, it would take China for such a dive you would never even fathom the amount of human misery that would happen in China. Especially once the surplus U.S. grain that feeds half of Africa stops flowing because people are consuming it internally because they can't import any foodstuffs. What do you think's going to happen to the third world? They're screwed. A lot of these countries rely upon U.S. food aid. Nobody else is going to give it to them because nobody else has a large enough surplus to do so. The Chinese aren't going to do it. They'll be hungry themselves. They're going to feed their own. So what happens to these countries? They're screwed. You'd be looking at probably a mass die-off in some parts of the third world. I know some people might cynically say, well, that's the third world, that's their own problem. That in turn does affect the world economy as well. So if you don't care about human beings and you just want to look at it from a monetary perspective, if you have that sort of mass die-off in the third world, it still affects the productivity of the world, so you're screwed either way. Even if you don't really care about them as human beings, as some of these corporate cronyists and insiders and these big bankers, they really don't care about anybody. They barely care about themselves. They'd burn themselves alive just to protect their money and not even care about using the money. They're that far gone. They're utterly, it's literally sort of like a dragon fever or something like that from Lord of the Rings or something with these people. They've got so much value, most of which is fake, but they're willing to convince people that it's real anyway and continue to use it as though it was real. They've got so much extravagant wealth that they become so obsessed with it that literally nothing else in the world matters to them. It's become a disease, almost like an addiction. But yeah, hard times may be to come. A lot of people are mentioning September or October. They're mentioning this fall. The fact that this coincides with the end of the blood moon tetrads, of course, perturbs people. I couldn't put a definitive date on it. It could be 2 years from now, but when it does happen, the longer it holds off from happening, the worse it could actually be. In fact, it would probably be best if it did happen this year and didn't drag on and on for years to come, simply, sort of replacing fake money with fake money over and over and over again as it spirals out of control. Everybody's in debt. Productivity's actually lower by far than it supposedly is. A lot less people are employed. That's a problem. And a lot of people are ignorant of this fact. They just don't notice the sort of seeping poverty around them, I guess. I've noticed it. I've seen it. I've seen it right in the downtown. I've seen it in our mall. And this is an area, by the way, Vermont is one of those areas that was largely sheltered from some of the worst aspects of the last recession. Some of the unemployment rate rise didn't affect us. It affected us disproportionately little compared to some states. So when I look at our mall that's now completely dilapidated and basically useless, or our downtown that's half empty, and I extrapolate this to the states that were worst hit, I say it must be far, far worse in those states. Even if I haven't visited them, I can assume and extrapolate that must be the case. And people can probably say in the comments, have you noticed this in the last 10 years? That, yeah, there are fewer businesses, there are fewer things to do, people are more paranoid, there's less money overall to go around. The government keeps saying the economy is growing and that jobs are being added and everything's fine, but we're not seeing it. I wonder if others have had basically a similar experience, and I've got to envision that it's basically the same right now in Russia, that it's basically the same right now in China, that it's basically the same anywhere you happen to be, with the exception of a micronation or something like that. So yeah, some doom and gloom for tonight. Yeah, it's a nice happy topic. That's about all. Peace out.